we kind of fell backwards into it in the sense that I started working in franchising a few years out of college, and I worked for a couple of different franchisors, and most of what I did was franchise sales and development. So, the idea for us to own our own franchise kind of happened over the course of several years of me being in the franchising world, constantly talking to people that were very entrepreneurial minded and people that were, out there looking at different business opportunities. So naturally, we started kind of, looking at, all right, maybe this is a pathway we should explore for ourselves. And
hi there. My name's Tommy Yionoulis, and I am the host of the brand new podcast, Empire Builders, scaling success one location at a time. This is a podcast dedicated to talking to the founders and the current leadership of those large multi-location brands that you see every single day where you eat and shop at. And we want to find out from these guys, why this business, right? Why of all the things you could do in the world, you chose to do this? We're going to learn what their challenges were at the beginning, what almost broke them. We're going to learn what they're facing today. And as always, we're going to end the show with a wonderful war story. That's one of those stories where you go, I can't believe we got through this. It was insanity, and hopefully they always end with a nice little laugh. So I can't tell you how excited I am to bring you these interviews with these amazing guests and just stoke that entrepreneurial flame that we all have to learn what it took to kind of get where they are today and how they got successful. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to sharing these wonderful interviews with you. Hey there, everybody. It's Tommy. It's a cold day here in Denver, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Empire Builders, the podcast about entrepreneurs and franchisees. Please welcome to the show today, Wes Barefoot. Wes, how you doing, man?
Tommy, I'm great, man. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for coming on. Wes, we run a tight ship around here, and I say that facetiously. We had 5 questions for you. I'd like to start with question number 1. Tell me about your current job and your current company.
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple things going on. First thing is my wife and I are franchisees with a company called Shelf Genie. So at Shelf Genie, we do high-end custom pull-out shelving and custom closet systems. We've been franchisees for coming up on 7 years now, which is kind of crazy to say that out loud, but it's been a wild ride. It's been really good. Since investing in that first franchise, we also owned a second franchise business that was in the insulation space. We built that up over about 3.5 years, and we sold that last November. And then I have a consulting business called Path to Freedom, and I help other people understand franchise ownership, figure out what's the right type of franchise for them in terms of general characteristics and business models. And then I recommend specific brands that meet the criteria. We work together to establish and coach them through the due diligence that's necessary for anyone to do before they pull the trigger on investing in a franchise. So really the consulting work and our Shelf Genie business is kind of our primary focus these days. Sure.
I'm excited to talk to you because you're doing franchises in 2 different verticals that we've never had anyone talk about, which are like, personal service business with the Shelf Genie, right? And like a design kind of concept. And then installation is something that, those are, I always talk to people in restaurants or, like haircuts and just more of the multi-location franchise businesses. And these are more like, you don't have to go buy a location. You just,
that's right. Yeah. And there's a lot of differences and nuances between, all these different types of franchises that are out there. And like the brick and mortar versus service based is kind of an easy way to start making that distinguishment. But even like with the 2 service based franchises we've owned, one being in insulation, one being in custom shelving, there's huge differences just in those 2 businesses that on paper would look pretty similar in terms of the way you go about scaling the business, the way you need to operate the business. And what we found is they're actually very different. So, happy to bring some insight in that because it is interesting, I think.
Yeah, because I guess for those of you who are listening, if you do a brick and mortar business, you have to remember, you're going to have to you got to find a location first and foremost, right? That's going to suck and it's going to be hard because if you get the wrong location, you're toast. That's absolutely the truth. Number two, you're going to have to do some form of build out. Like we were talking to a guy from, the cookie company that's right by my house. I just can't think of the name
Crumble
of it.
or Dirty Dough?
Crumble. Yeah,
Crumble.
his build out was $600K in some of his locations.
Yeah,
so
I believe it.
Rent. And by the way, you got to get the thing leased. You got to start paying rent immediately as you get it leased. You might get some CAM or some money towards your build out, but you got this huge build out. Then you got to get your business started and staffed. And depending on how long that build out is, you're paying rent the whole time.
That's right.
Brick and mortar, there you need to be way better capitalized for a brick and mortar than you do with a service business. Not to say you don't need to have money for a service business, you do, but you're going to have way more upfront costs and way more cash rolling out the door on day one than you are going to have with a service business, right? So there's just a lot there. So let's talk about your cabinet business first, and then I want to talk about the installation business, and then I want you to kind of compare and contrast, like what, like you said, there are differences, even though they kind of both service businesses, they're really different. Yeah,
very different. Yeah, so with the Shelf Genie business, that was the first franchise that we invested in. That was our first, step into business ownership. And, we kind of fell backwards into it in the sense that I started working in franchising a few years out of college, and I worked for a couple of different franchisors, and most of what I did was franchise sales and development. So, the idea for us to own our own franchise kind of happened over the course of several years of me being in the franchising world, constantly talking to people that were very entrepreneurial minded and people that were, out there looking at different business opportunities. So naturally, we started kind of, looking at, all right, maybe this is a pathway we should explore for ourselves. And Shelf Genie, I happened to get recruited to go work at Shelf Genie by the original founder. And I took over their franchise sales and development. So I spent a year and a half or so selling the franchise, helping other people evaluate the opportunity and, get in as franchisees. And then, my wife had been in pharmaceutical sales and was doing that, and it was fine. But then she got laid off. And that was kind of the catalyst. Like I said, we'd been kind of having some of these conversations on our own, thinking we were kind of moving in that direction, but I think that kind of kicked us in the ass a little bit and probably made us move on that quicker than we would have. But what I learned with Shelf Genie was a lot of the things that you just pointed out in terms of the amount of capital that we needed up front, just the type of infrastructure that's needed in something that's a service-based business versus brick and mortar. I mean, I was 29, she was 26 when we started Shelf Genie. Like, we didn't have a huge net worth. We didn't have a lot of borrowing power at that point. And, you mentioned it still takes capital to start any of these franchises out there. And it did, but, in comparison to most of these kind of traditional brick and mortar concepts that you're going to see, something like a Shelf Genie was far less capital intensive. And, you didn't need a physical location. So we didn't have to sign a lease. It's what they call a home-based franchise, at least in the beginning. Today we have a warehouse and office space and all of that. But, so it was relatively low startup cost. The other thing we really liked about it is that it's also a very lean, low overhead business model. And this is one of the key differences between that and the insulation business that we own, where we did have a lot more overhead in order to operate that business. But with Shelf Genie, it's no inventory, right? We sell a high-end custom product. So, we go in, we do these in-depth design consultations with our clients. We price everything out. Then they sign a purchase agreement with us and pay us a deposit before we have to turn around and order anything. And, at that point, once we place an order with our manufacturing company is when we're on the hook, to actually incur any cost related to the product or the materials. So you have that component of it. Shelf Genie's always kind of recommended a more of a subcontractor model, meaning our salespeople, which we call designers, and our installers are commission only, right? So we didn't have like a fixed payroll, which is especially helpful in the beginning stages of a business. So it was all those things kind of combined. The other thing we liked about it was that, and we were able to easily see this through the work I'd been doing selling the franchise, but just the normal due diligence anyone would do on a franchise, it's a high average ticket or average transaction business. At the time, I think, the system-wide average for Shelf Genie was north of $5,000 per job. In our franchise, it's closer to $7,000 today. So, you talk about ramp up time. This is the type of business that has the potential to ramp up much quicker because there's not a whole lot of work to do before you launch the business. So we were able to open much quicker after initially signing franchise agreements. And then, you don't have to sell that many jobs in a business like that to get to the point where you're doing $30, $40, $50,000 a month in revenue. Whereas some of these brick and mortar concepts, not only are you 9 to 12 months out just to get open, it can take a while to ramp and get to where you've got some pretty consistent, strong revenue numbers coming in.
Absolutely. And I think too, the way you have to look at this, and I always worry that I'm repeating myself on every episode, right? But you have to look at this like when you start any kind of any business for yourself, you have to calculate how much cash you have, right?
Yeah.
Whether you borrowed it, whether, it's your own money, you got it from friends and family and fools, whatever it is, you have this pile of money. Then you have your living expenses, right? Because you're not going to throw your kid out of school. You're not going to just live on the streets. You have to get your monthly nut. You got to subtract that out. And then and then you have your business expenses, right? Your bare minimum business expenses. And whatever's left, so you have all these expenses and you have this pile of money, and you have these monthly costs you're going to incur. And that's essentially how long your business is going to function without revenue, right? How long can I have $100,000. It costs me $10,000 a month to live and to run my business. I have 10 months to start generating revenue. And then every dollar of revenue you generate after that extends your business's oxygen out longer, right? And then if you spend more than 10 a month, your business has less oxygen. I mean, that's just how it is. So anything you can do, like you did with your business, all those things that you talked about, not having huge upfront costs, doing it with subs, having subs for salespeople, high average ticket, no brick and mortar, all these different things, that allowed you to have longer amount of time to actually go make sales.
Yeah.
Because the thing that no one and I want to talk about this because you were in sales, your wife was in sales. Everything takes longer to do than you think it is, and every deal takes longer to close. People they don't call you back, they go silent for 2 months. And if you think you can put a budget together, but you're not going to hit that budget because people are going to just drag stuff out.
Yeah, there's no such thing as an easy deal. That's for sure, at least in our experience.
No.
One thing I'll add, because you're exactly right, and I think it's probably the number one reason that small businesses fell, whether you're talking franchise or not, is people are undercapitalized from the beginning. They don't have enough capital on hand to really give themselves the runway that they need to get the business going, get some momentum behind it. So understanding the cash flow model in a business is so important too, because this is one of the things that, I looking back on it, I think we kind of took it for granted with our Shelf Genie business because it's a really nice cash flow business, primarily because of what I mentioned earlier, where we take a 50% deposit up front. So other than some marketing costs to get our salesperson or our designer in the door, we haven't really incurred any cost at that point. And so then we get a 50% deposit that more than covers our entire material cost on a job. It also covers the commission that we pay to our salesperson. And then we get terms with our manufacturing company. So they invoice us 30 days after the product ships to us, meaning unless for some reason we're waiting on the customer to be ready for us to come in and install the job, we're installed, we collect final payment the day we do the install. So we're installed, paid in full before we have to pay for the materials. Again, because of the subcontractor nature, we don't have a fixed payroll. And then all the fees that you have because you're a franchise are tied to how much revenue, you're bringing in too. So that was a really nice cash flow model. We get into the insulation business, and part of what attracted us to that business was the new construction component, because Shelf Genie was primarily retrofit. We're going in and working with existing homeowners. And we kept thinking, there's got to be, a way that we can get our product in with not every home builder, right? In the case of the products we do at Shelf Genie, but some of these higher end custom builders. And so we saw a way to do that through the insulation business. There were other things we liked about it too, but one thing we didn't think through enough, and we kind of had to learn it the hard way, is that you go in and you start doing too much of your business with these builders. Yeah. You got to really manage cash flow, and you need a lot more upfront capital because they're going to expect payment terms from you, right? So every builder we worked with expected at least net 30 terms, meaning we come in, we provide the insulation, we install it, we incur the labor costs, the whole nine, and they're wanting at least 30 days to pay it. And what we really learned the hard way is that in the world of new construction, net 30 really means more like net 60, maybe net 90. Tommy, I've never heard the phrase checks in the mail so many times until we got into the insulation business and started dealing with home builders. And so, and part of the mistake was ours, that we went too heavy into that new construction side of the business, where, we could have done more residential retrofit type stuff. And so anyways, I think if you're prepared for that, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because there's a lot of advantages to that type of a business too. Like in the insulation business, we didn't need nearly the type of budget for marketing and advertising that we do in Shelf Genie, because you come in, you do good work for these builders, they're going to keep using you, they're going to keep feeding you business. So it's not all negative, but we weren't probably as prepared for that much longer cash flow cycle as we should have been.
Well, and the other thing you have to worry about too is like these builders, they're always cash strapped too. They always push their subs out because they know their subs are depending on them. So, and a lot of these house deals fall through, and especially in this time frame when the interest rates have been high, people have a lot of contingent deals out there, right? They're ready to sell their house. They can't sell their house, so then they fall through on the new house. So now the home builder, it doesn't have the cash flow coming in on the new home. So they're trying to keep their doors open, so they don't want to pay the subs. And so it just slides down all levels of the economy. So but then you're right. There are super advantages to being with a home builder, because you can have one crew parked on one cul-de-sac for 2 weeks, just dropping insulation in, working 60 hours a week, making you a fortune in the future. But you're not going to get it today, right? Like no one's going to pay today.
Yeah, it's I tell people, as I'm kind of coaching people through this whole process of, what are the right types of franchise? Like so much of it's a kind of a personal decision, right? Like the right franchise for me is not necessarily going to be the right franchise for the next person. Like there's definitely not a one size fits all approach to like what's the best franchise out there, but these are things to be thinking about. And they all have pros and cons, even talking about, brick and mortar versus service. Like I work with a lot of really great brick and mortar concepts, and there's a lot of individuals I work with that the brick and mortar model is going to make a hell of a lot more sense for them than something that's more service based, even though it typically requires more upfront capital. It's a longer, runway to opening. It's a longer ramp up and all of that. It's also a lot to like about those types of businesses if you have the financial ability to look far enough out.
Sure. And the reality is like, I'm a restaurant guy. Like I probably wouldn't want to do Shelf Genie just because
there's that too.
Like, I don't care about shelves,
Yeah.
Like,
you don't want to own an insulation business. You're not passionate about insulation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. But it's funny because I have the cigar club of all these dudes, and this new guy, Kent, who's in the cigar club, he owns an insulation distributor. He owns several insulation companies, and he's very wealthy.
I believe it. Yeah, I believe it.
Okay. He's always at the McLaren dealership, going from like, Lamborghini to McLaren to like, all kinds of stuff. So he's doing it. But because insulation too is one of those things that it's not sexy, but you need it. Like personally, my house here, it's a 1991 house. I've had multiple frozen pipes, and I've had severe water damage because this was a 1991 house and the insulation in the walls sucked. And so we had like a super cold snap last February, had a pipe burst right in my office. Luckily I was home, was able to stop it from blowing it out. But, it was a big deal. And so like insulation's not sexy, but guess what? Everybody needs it. And it's gotten so much better. It's actually worth it. Like we had to blow in 8 inches of insulation in our attic and put all this other insulation in. My power bill came down. I have a pretty high
for sure.
These houses aren't well insulated. So,
it's needed. And, it's a commodity, right? But it's needed. And so it's another thing worth, thinking about as you're evaluating different opportunities, something like our Shelf Genie business, that's a nice to have, not a need to have. It's much more of a niche business. And so, had we decided to stay in the insulation business, long term, that business has a much higher ceiling in terms of what, we could have built it into compared to our Shelf Genie business. And so I'm not surprised to hear your cigar buddies, got a nice car collection and has done well, because I know other people in the insulation industry that have done the same. And I mean, we did 7 figures in revenue in our first 12 months in business in that. And that was without really we identified an opportunity with some of the home builders. We knew that our area was lacking with good quality insulation contractors. And so, that was 7 figures without us spending a dime on marketing or advertising, or, it was kind of just fell into our lap once we made some initial contacts. And so it's, like I said, pros and cons to all these things.
And, it's interesting too. You just brought up a different aspect that we should talk about. If you buy a brick and mortar business, you're really buying a brand, and you kind of hide behind that brand, right? Like if I buy a Taco Bell, then everybody knows what they're going to get from my Taco Bell, right?
Yes.
I'm going to have a C rating on Yelp. Hopefully it's clean. Hopefully you get what you ordered and it's crunchy, right? Whatever it is. But your business is more like your name.
Yes.
And that's a different thing. Like your name, your reputation is on the line with your insulation business because it was more relationship based, right? Totally. There is advertising on insulation, or not much. Same thing with your Shelf Genie business. It's more about you. So for instance, my wife is a financial advisor. And so her name is out there for good or bad. The market's great. Everybody loves her. The market's garbage. Everyone's mad at her. And it's
that's right.
I don't run the market, but it's a personal business, a personal relationship, and she doesn't she likes to keep her clients over there. She doesn't talk to people about it unless they ask her. She's not like at a dinner party going, hey, what's your 401k? Like, you know what I mean? Well, it's separate, but that is another component of these two businesses.
Yeah, it's a good point.
My Taco Bell and never know I owned it, right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think one way to look at it is, because anyone that's considering a franchise, they're at some point in the process calculating value exchange, right? What is it going to cost me to, upfront to become a franchisee? What's it going to cost me on an ongoing basis to be a franchisee? And what am I getting in exchange for that? And I think that value exchange looks very different depending on the type of business that you're in. In the food side of franchising, so much of the value is in the brand name, right? You mentioned Taco Bell, McDonald's. I mean, that's where so much of the value is. And I would argue that's the case for most of what you see in brick and mortar. Whereas in service-based, the brand name is far less valuable. And I've seen people do very well, become extremely wealthy, owning a franchise that you would never even recognize the brand name of it. But the value exchange a lot of times comes in, upfront. It's training, it's systems, it's processes, it's streamlining all of that. But the real value exchange can come, through buying power, right? Any of these service-based businesses where there's an actual product component, us as an individual insulation company or shelving company don't have nearly the buying power that the franchise as a whole does. And so they can really, work to reduce our cost of goods. And, like with our Shelf Genie business coming up on 7 years, I don't really need the franchisor for much of anything other than keep the quality of the product great and keep my prices as low as you possibly can to keep providing a quality product for us. Everything else they were very helpful in the beginning as we were learning. But the reason I bring that up is I think, a lot of people focus so much on, all right, what's the value I'm getting up front if I invest in this franchise? And they should, that's important. But I know a lot of franchisees that now that they've been in business for a long time, they're kind of bitter because they feel like they get, next to nothing in exchange for the fees that they continue to pay. So it's just something that you want to look at as best as you can is, what's the ongoing value that I can expect to get if I, become a franchisee with this particular brand.
Yeah. But here's, I would say, the counterpoint to that, because I get it, because I used to work at Quiznos, and, franchisees hate franchisors. They hate paying those franchise fees, and they forget about the value that the franchisor brings. And by the way, the franchisor has to continue to bring value to justify that cost. But like you said, for your Shelf Genie business, right? You talk to salespeople, a sales guy, like, I could have my own shelf company. I could sell you a bill of goods. Hey man, I got the best shelves in the world. Then you quit Shelf Genie. You go out, you blow a couple of deals because I make garbage shelves. And now you got pissed off customers. You're refunding money. You got pissed off trades. You got a bad Yelp review, a bad Google review. Like people, they take for granted the things that actually are in some ways very hard to do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, 100%. As a franchisee, I don't have any issue with the fees that we pay, because we're continuing to get that value, and 100% franchisees take a lot of it for granted. I'm coaching people through this process of researching franchises. The biggest piece of the research you can do is go talk to other franchisees that are already in the business. And I remind people, I'm like, look, just so you know, you will never meet a franchisee that only has good things to say about their franchisor. That will never happen. So yeah, we're probably, as franchisees, over scrutinize that a lot. But if the value continues, and through something like a big brand name, that's continued value, right? Sure. If the brand continues to be valuable, that's still, valuable, just as much so, if not more, than when you were first getting started. But yeah, it's important. And franchising is like most things in this world. They're not all created equally, and not all franchises do as good of a job as, continuing to provide value to their franchisees. So it's just something that people should look at and understand as best they can. Yep.
And I always say this too, and I always risk repeating myself, but at the end of the day, it's your business. So you sign up with a franchisor, you make your best choice. And then if they're lacking in some areas, you have to take a two-pronged approach. One is you have to become a giant pain in their butt through the franchise committee and council. You got to be on the phone with them. Yeah, just, hey, you got to fix this, man. You got to fix this, and just stay in their face and hammer them, because that's the one thing that when you work at the franchisor you hate, is just a franchisee yelling at you every single day about why you haven't fixed something. They squeaky wheel gets the grease. They will eventually get it done. But then number two is, you buy into the franchise and you got your contract, whatever. And there's a lot of times there's non-competes. You can't just go open up Shelf Wizard, on your own. They'll come after you, whatever. But it's still your business. So if the franchisor is not living up to what they need to do for your business to be successful, then you've got to take the action.
Yeah,
you can't complain about it. You better go take the action.
Yeah, you got to go make it happen. It's the old adage, no one's coming to save you, right? It's not the franchisor's job to come in and build a profitable business for you. They should be holding up their end of the bargain, but like I said earlier, no franchisee is ever going to sit there and be like, yes, my franchisor is doing everything they said they were going to do as well as I expected them to do it. And I think a lot of times there's unrealistic expectations involved in that. But, the best analogy, I'll try to keep this short, but the best analogy I ever got from a mentor of mine, he was the founder and CEO of the first franchise company that I went to work for. He said, franchising is like a bicycle. It's the franchisor's job to build the best bike that they can, right? And, we can extend this analogy out and say, there's so many different types of bikes out there, right? So you need to make sure you pick the right type of bike for what it is you want to accomplish. If you live in Denver, you probably don't want a beach cruiser. You probably need a mountain bike of some sort, right? So there's that whole component of it. But the point he was really trying to drive home is, it doesn't matter how good of a bike the franchisor builds. If the franchisee doesn't get on it and pedal it, it's not going to go anywhere. If they get on it and they kind of half-ass pedal it, it's going to go, but you're not going to win any races, and you're probably not going to be all that proud of your biking experience. But if you've got a good bike and you get on the bike and you pedal your ass off, like that's where winning happens. And I think a lot of people do unfortunately have unrealistic expectations of what the franchisor's responsibility in all of this is. It's not their job to come build the business for you.
Sure. Hey, I do have a question for you, just to wrap up the brick and mortar versus the service business. What do you find that the service business franchise fees are lower than the brick and mortar franchise fees as a whole?
Not the fees. The fees are pretty consistent across the board, regardless, like the initial franchise fees that you pay up front, the ongoing fee structure, royalties and things like that. No, it's all pretty similar. You hit the nail on the head earlier. The big difference between, the franchise that's going to, take $700,000, $800,000 in capital to launch versus one that's $200,000 is the build out, right? Or the startup cost, right? So what costs do you need to incur to get the business open and operating? So if it's brick and mortar, you got to go sign the lease, you got to do the build out, depending on the business, equipment, inventory. You start running sales and marketing or marketing and advertising 2-3 months out from opening. You're hiring people well ahead of opening. So that's where the big difference is between, these franchises that do require so much more capital.
Sure. So, okay. So that was question number one. Question number two is, why did you pick Shelf Genie of all the other ones? Like you sold a bunch of these things, you knew about them. Why did you pick Shelf Genie?
Yeah, it's for a couple of reasons. I mean, some of it was probably familiarity, right? Because I did at that point, I'd been with the organization for a year, and I had a really good understanding of like what that business, how that business needed to be run to be successful. Because, any franchise out there, I don't care what brand it is or how long it's been around, there's a bell curve in terms of franchisee performance. You've always got top performers, underperformers, everything in between. Shelf Genie is no different. So I kind of had a front row seat to like, all right, what are the top performers doing differently and better than everyone else? And I felt very confident that, my wife and I could come in and execute and build our business in a similar manner to what I saw the top performers doing. And then it was a lot of the other things that I mentioned, comparatively speaking, it didn't require a ton of capital, right? Like we weren't in a position then to go and invest in something that was going to require, $500,000-$600,000. I mean, hell, probably not even like $200,000 or $300,000. Shelf Genie for us was about a, $150,000 all-in investment. That's what we kind of came to the table with, including our initial working capital. And then it was really that low overhead nature. Like we felt a lot more comfortable taking that leap, knowing that, hey, if things do take a little bit longer to ramp up than, we're expecting, or if something crazy happens that slows us down in the beginning, we're not going to be bleeding money while we're trying to recover from that. And, I won't give it away because I think one of your questions is, what were some early challenges, but that ended up being a really smart decision on our part looking back on it.
Well, yeah, and that was the next question. So what were some of your early challenges? Like what are the things that you faced on day one that you're like, holy crap?
Yeah, it wasn't day one, but it was like 3 weeks in. So we live in coastal North Carolina, and our territory for Shelf Genie is Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, up through, Wilmington and Jacksonville, North Carolina. And this would have been 2018. We had the worst hurricane that like the Wilmington area has experienced in quite some time come through, and basically the most of the damage came from flooding, roads being washed out and things like that. So, Wilmington and some of the beach areas to the south of Wilmington basically got cut off from everything else for a solid week and a half, closer to 2 weeks after the storm came through. And so, it just brought the business to a screeching halt, right? Like everyone was dealing with, if they evacuated, trying to get back home, if they were there, you couldn't, supplies and stuff. It was, it was a rough time for everyone in that area, like right in the heart of our territory. And, so it like I said, was a good thing that, part of our decision was, hey, let's try to find a business where we're not going to have $10, $20, $30, $40,000 in fixed expenses every month, because that could have killed us before we even really had a chance to get started.
Sure.
Had we lost basically a 3 weeks, within our first month of business, and been bleeding all of that money, I don't know if we would have recovered from that or not. So that was a challenging time.
If you had brick and mortar, the reality is too, that place might have gotten flooded out, and then you have to try to open it back up. You're going to get insurance money, but insurance money doesn't come quick.
Well, yeah, exactly.
It takes months, and you got to prove that you've built the stuff out and fixed it correctly, and they have to have inspectors, and then they hold the cash. We got hit by a tornado, and just a very level 1 tornado. It caused a lot of exterior damage to our home, but they're just dealing with all that. Getting those checks took 6 months.
I can't even imagine how. I know how tough it is to deal with the insurance companies, especially when it involves them giving you money. Yeah. So I can't even imagine the headaches to go with that. And so, and that whole process of us starting with because I think a lot of times, as people are looking at different businesses, there's a status kind of, thought process, right? And you kind of said this, who wants to own an insulation business? And we kind of felt the same about Shelf Genie, and it in some ways almost didn't look like a real business, right? Because you don't need a location, you're not putting signage up on your building, doesn't have a lot of the things that so many people associate with starting your own business. And fortunately, we didn't let that stop us, but we did have some of those thoughts. But, here we are 7 years later. It's a multiple 7-figure business for us. It's, changed our life in so many ways. We have 3 kids, so from an income standpoint, from a, control of our time, flexibility, lifestyle standpoint, but it's also opened all these other doors. And I think it was having some quick wins in a business that was not as expensive to get up and running, pretty damn simple from a moving parts and pieces standpoint. It started building our confidence real quick, and then it was only a couple of years later that, okay, hey, let's go try to get into something that's got a bigger ceiling, right? With the insulation business. And that was, $400,000 plus, all in initial investment because of the infrastructure that's needed. You're talking trucks and trailers and equipment and warehouse and, employees. We had a full-time salaried manager when we launched that business. And we learned a lot in the process, right? We probably underestimated some of that. It might have made us a little cocky, but more than anything, I think it gave us some good experience, some good confidence. And, it pretty quickly, with that first franchise in Shelf Genie, it pretty quickly got us to where we were making more than we were, when we were employed by other people. And it's what opened the door for me to start the consulting business that I do too.
Sure. So what are you facing today with the Shelf Genie? What are your kind of the issues you run into?
Yeah, there's been a couple things. So one is we've had a change of ownership, and it's not recent. It's at the franchisor level. Yeah. So when we bought our Shelf Genie franchise, it was the original founder, and he had a few outside investors over the years, and that was the ownership group and kind of the board of the company. So it was there were probably, 60, 70 franchisees, 250 territories, being operated across the country with Shelf Genie. And then they got acquired by a company called Neighborly, who's massive in the home service sector of franchising. They, own over 20 different home service franchise brands under this Neighborly umbrella. And, it's not been all bad by any stretch. There's a lot that, a big multi-billion-dollar organization owning your franchise brand can bring to the table. But there's definitely been changes, and it's definitely very different today than it was, 3-4 years ago when, it was this kind of smaller, much more entrepreneurial feeling organization that we were franchisees with. So that's one, just kind of navigating that, right? From a leadership standpoint, all the people that were there when, we came on board and started building our business, it's all totally different people now, and there's it's a totally different process, right? If I've got a great idea, I used to be able to call the CEO of Shelf Genie and we'd talk for 2 hours on the phone, right? I don't quite have that access any longer. And then the other thing is just, the world's a weird place right now, with elections coming up and interest rates higher. And, Shelf Genie is a not inexpensive, high-end elective, home improvement project. And so people are being a little more discretionary with their money. And, our business is actually up a little bit this year over this time last year, but our number of appointments are down. And so it's been a challenge to figure out, all right, how do we go get in front of the right people with the right message that have the means as well as the interest, and they're not going to let, the economy or impending doom coming from the election or whatever, impact, their investments in their home that they're going to make. So it's navigating that's been challenging, but also kind of interesting. It's kind of like a puzzle to solve.
Yeah. And that's all marketing, right?
Yeah.
Marketing and sales is all just figuring out how do I get this guy to pull the trigger.
That's it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's super interesting. Yeah. I mean, I can get it. You got bought by private equity backed place. And so they just have a different mentality, right?
Yeah, and like I said, it's not all bad. It's not all bad at all. It's just, I think it's been a harder transition for some of those that were around in like some of the earlier days. It's just different, right? Like most people don't love change. So it's certainly not been all bad. They've got deep pockets, right? So like we have a brand new manufacturing facility out in Arizona that is light years ahead of where the other one was. Like definitely not all bad, but there were some times, especially when like some of the leadership was changing out, there were just some emotions and it was different, so navigating that and that's happening in franchising, right? Like franchise brands are getting bought by private equity and some of these conglomerates and stuff. And so like, one thing I always tell people is, if you're researching a franchise, like do not buy the franchise just because you love the founder of the brand. Like it's good that you do, right? But you don't know for sure that they're going to be around forever. Like you need to really like the business and have confidence in the sustainability of the model and all these things. And, you don't want to overthink that because you don't have a crystal ball. You don't know, if an acquisition would happen or when, but it's just like, you don't buy it solely because like, hey, I really like this founder. And I think that, he's going to have my back no matter what. And
the other point of that too is, like you said, like just assume your franchisor is going to sell because that's just what happens. I mean, like one of our clients is Qdoba, and they've been owned by 3 or 4 different companies in the like 4 years we've been with them. Like that's just the way it is.
Can you tell them to put one in Wilmington, North Carolina, for God's sake?
Yeah.
Chipotle, Moe's, like all that is garbage compared to Qdoba.
No, they have the best. Yeah, I like that.
Oh man, I would love to have a Qdoba in our area. Tell them to get on.
I'll let them know that you said that. So
yeah.
Yeah, they're good dudes. Okay, we're at the war story time. So, Wes, give me a war story. Like just one of those crazy. It could be from anything. Can't believe we got through it. Oh my God, horrible, nuts.
I'm gonna give you one from my consulting work, only because it kind of came to mind as you were telling me that someone else had a run-in with Somalian pirates apparently, and I don't have anything quite that exciting, but in the consulting work I do, I work with people all over North America, and as you can imagine, I talk to a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, with a lot of different goals. And so I got actually referred. This guy got referred to me by someone I'd worked with a few years ago and helped get into a franchise. And this guy's up in the New Jersey area, and we get on the phone. It was a Zoom call actually. And, I could tell from his name, and then by getting on the phone with him and hearing his accent, he's Russian.
Yeah.
No big deal, right? So, we keep, and in fact, the guy that had referred him to me also from Russia originally. So it wasn't like a surprise. It wasn't a big deal. So we kind of just getting to know each other a little bit. And, as we're getting ready to wrap up the first call, I'd kind of explained to him what next steps were. And he goes, hey, one thing I just want to make sure you're aware of, and this may or may not, impact how we move forward, but I have a felony. And I'm like, okay. Thank you for letting me know. Like, definitely better that we know this ahead of time, because a lot of franchisors are just going to have kind of a blanket policy that, if you have a felony or a bankruptcy, you won't be approved to become a franchisee. So he said, is that a deal breaker for all franchise companies? And I said, no, it's probably 50-50 out of all the brands I work with. Some of them would look at that and say, we'll judge it on a case-by-case basis. And then, half of them are probably going to say, no, sorry, it's just our company policy. And I said, one thing to think about is it's probably like the larger, more established brands are probably going to be more on the side of like having that blanket policy, whereas some of the more up and coming emerging brands are probably a little more willing to look at it case by case. So I said, just wrap your head around that. It may end up that we have to focus more on up and coming brands. Anyways, long story short, I do all this legwork, because my goal with someone is, get to know them well enough to make sure I understand their goals, their interests, their experience, their skill set, and the type of lifestyle that they're looking for in owning the business. And then, I have relationships with hundreds of the top franchises across the country, and I can come back and recommend specific brands that really line up for them. So I'm doing all this legwork for this guy, which is part of my normal process. But in addition to that, I'm having to, reach out to every single brand and kind of tell this story like, hey, by the way, this is kind of this guy's situation. And it wasn't like a felony where like, violence was involved. Yeah. It was more like a white collar type sure. deal. Right. So anyways, I got some really good brands that said, yeah, we're happy to talk with them, as long as it's nothing more than what you've kind of shared with us. Like, we don't think it'll be an issue. This goes on for months and months and months. And, finally gets down to like a brand that he wants to move forward with. The brand is going to do it. And I don't remember exactly what triggered it, because it wasn't part of this brand's normal process to run a background check, but it had something to do with he pulled in an attorney to talk to their attorney to try to negotiate some language on the franchise agreement, which I don't typically recommend. It's not usually a good use of resources. But anyways, his attorney mentioned something to their attorney that his attorney came back to the CEO of the company and said, hey, I think we need to run a background check on this guy. And it turns out, in addition to the one felony he told me about, he had several others, as well as clear connections to the Russian mob. No. And at that point, I was like, I'm out. Like, this is not worth the commission that I would earn on this. Like, this is not worth, like, I'm out. Like, I'm done. So that was like one of those moments where you kind of like look at yourself in the mirror and you're like, yo, that was kind of wild, or could have been wild, And so, I guess it taught me a lesson to maybe ask a little more questions on the front end if that sort of thing is brought to my attention before. So,
well, and two, you're like, God, is this guy going to come after me now because I'm not going to get him in this franchise? Like,
thought crossed my mind, man. And like, before I knew that, there were, part of my job. It's not my job to make decisions for people, right? I cannot say, hey, you should buy a franchise. You should not buy a franchise. I can't say buy this franchise over this one. It's my job to give you a methodical process to follow and show you how to go get the information you need to make good, educated decisions for yourself. It's also my job to push back a little bit sometimes, right? If I think you're looking at something incorrectly, I'm going to point that out to you and explain to you why. Again, I'm not making decisions for people, but he and I had a couple of, conversations where we were butting heads a little bit, right? And some of it was over the legal stuff. I was just kind of trying to tell him, like, this is not what most brands do. Like, this brand's already gone above and beyond, in numerous instances to like try and work with you, and you just keep trying to take a little bit more and a little bit more. I said, it's going to get to a point of diminishing return, and they're just going to pull the offer. And so there was a little bit of friction between me and him from some of the coaching I was trying to give him. And then it was like a day later, I get a call from the CEO. He's like, guess what we just found when we ran this background check. And so the thought was like, shit, did he ever get my address? Is he?
Yeah.
I know he knows what state I'm in, but could he, how easy would it be for him to find me? So that was earlier this year. So hopefully we're in the clear, unless I hope he doesn't hear this either, but,
I mean, it is what it is.
Any names or any describing information, but yeah, that was a pretty wild one.
Yeah, it was like what's the show with Jason Bateman down in? Where he's the money launderer.
Yeah, it's a great show. What is it?
I can't think of it right now, but I love him. He's great.
He is great. He is great.
But yeah, you think about his whole new career. You could just get people set up to be money laundering for the Russian mom. You sell a bunch of Subways. Anyway, Wes, that's a great story, man. Thank you so much for being on the show. Do you want to give anybody put some URLs out there for people to look up for you?
Yeah, sure. If anyone's listening to this and curious about owning their own franchise and how to get into it, I mean, I know Tommy's talking to a lot of really interesting people with their own stories to share, and hopefully that gives you some ideas in terms of just some of the different types of franchises that are out there. But literally what I do is help people get some clarity on all the noise that's out there in terms of the different types of franchises and which ones could make sense for you. And like I said, it's a very methodical process that we have, and it's completely free of charge. There's no obligation. I get paid by the franchise companies if and when I introduce them to someone that ends up becoming a franchisee. So if you're curious about any of this, I'd love to talk with you, see if I can help. Most of the people I work with, it's very exploratory for them in the beginning. It's rare that someone comes to me and says, Wes, I know I want to own a franchise, I just don't know which one. So it's a very consultative, educational approach is the way that I try to do it. So my consulting company is Path to Freedom, and the website is Path, PATH, the number 2 FRDM.com. So Path to Freedom, kind of short form on the freedom. And I do a podcast as well called the Path to Freedom Podcast. I usually point everyone to YouTube because my editor does a really good job with the videos. And we put, some other stuff up on YouTube that's not just the podcast. So you can find that at Franchise to Freedom. So it's franchise, the number 2 freedom on YouTube. And just like Tommy's doing, I talk to a lot of successful entrepreneurs that have great story, great advice to share. I interview a lot of the founders and CEOs of the franchise brands that I work with. And I also just interview a lot of entrepreneurs that are not involved in franchising at all, because it's stuff that I'm curious about personally. And I think anyone that, likes the aspect of financial freedom, time freedom, there's probably something for you on the Path to Freedom podcast.
Cool, man. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Wes. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll have some new episodes for you coming up soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Tommy.